Hey everyone. Okay, so I'm making this video because I want to begin to speak into the elephant in the room as far as singularity is concerned. And that elephant in the room is that, brace yourselves, this is dedicated, singularity is dedicated to a spiritual politics. Now, immediately, you're probably having your mind go where my mind goes, which is like, well, I guess we've just stripped the teeth of this thing down to nothing and that it's going to go nowhere because the spiritual politics is basically totally unrealistic to land anything in our world. And I want to speak into that. I want to speak into that presumption. And I want to speak into how I feel like it betrays, it illuminates a fundamental schism that exists, particularly in Western culture, which must be healed, which necessitates a radically transformative integration of things that we have not been able to integrate, and is actually rationally, absolutely the thing that needs to happen. So I want to make this video to go into this stuff. So another way to talk about this is that singularity is dedicated to the reintegration of church and state. Shock, horror, terror, oh my God. Possibly some of the reactions that start to move through people as we talk about this kind of thing. I want to explain exactly what I mean by that reintegration of church and state. First of all, I don't mean church. I don't mean a organized religion. I don't mean the institution of any kind of religion. What I mean is our sense of the sacred. Singularity is about the reintegration of our sense of the sacred with politics, right? Now, you say, but John, our sense of the sacred, that's a private matter. That's something that exists just within the religious kind of communities, and everyone has a different sense of the sacred. How on earth could we base something like politics, which is so relevant and important to society as a whole, on something that's going to be so diverse according to people's different beliefs and so on? Well, that, again, is a perspective that betrays the issue that I want to speak into. And the issue that I want to speak into is that our conception within Western civilization of what it means to really have a living relationship with the sacred is based on a fundamental schism that exists within our culture between the esoteric and the exoteric dimensions of our religions, right? So this is not a schism that exists in the same way in the East. In the East, these two dimensions of a religious tradition have been able to stay in relative right and healthy relationship. Of course, there's various issues, but the history of religion in the West is very different. Now, what I want to go into here is that a healthy religious tradition, and just stay with me for a minute because I'm not saying that the integration of church and state that I'm speaking about is about a religion. This is a jump off base. Stay with me. But a healthy religion has both an exoteric dimension to it and an esoteric dimension to it. The exoteric dimension to a religion is basically its worldview, the worldview that it invites you into. Often it has some kind of creation story. There may be a god or not a god, some kind of all-pervading, beneficent reality. And it also has prescriptions for what it means to live a good life, right? Those are basically the ingredients of the exoteric part of a religious tradition. Now, the esoteric parts of a religious tradition are about the transformational practices that a person can enter into to have experiential opening and revelation of the divine and of the sacred. The esoteric dimensions of any coherent spiritual religious pathway are not about belief. Again, shock horror, because actually that seems to be the defining characteristic of someone who is a kind of card-carrying, healthy religious adherent in the West, or someone who is not, whether they believe. whether they've chosen to believe something, whether they've had experiences that have led them to believe something. Just that, just that idea that our relationship to the sacred is dependent upon a choice to believe something or not is something that's a problem. There's not no problem with people believing things, but it's a problem that we believe that connection to the sacred is dependent upon belief. It's not. And that's something which is known within the esoteric dimensions of any healthy religious or spiritual tradition and has been known for thousands of years for those who have participated in them. Now, the problem is in the history of Western civilization, there's been a tendency to try and kill the people who have been participants in the esoteric dimensions of our religious traditions. In the history of early Christianity, that's been the case. And there's numerous examples, which I won't go into about that, when Christianity became politicized and became a tool of became a tool of political power. You know, there's many examples of the early councils that happened in the formation and development of early Christianity, where the the arms and forces of extreme political and social control deeply came into it, and of course, those dimensions of the teaching and the tradition, which basically ignite a sense of freedom and independent thought and autonomous connection to the sacred that does not depend on someone else, were deemed to be problematic, and there was huge amounts of hostility and threat that were directed towards them. Sufis, for instance, within the Islamic tradition, have also been heavily persecuted. Sufism is one of the aspects of the Islamic tradition that carries its esoteric dimensions. Again, has been a focus of massive persecution, threat, and danger. If we go back to the point that I made previously around the Eastern traditions being different, that is just the case. You know, if you look at the history of Hinduism, although I get that the term Hinduism is itself problematic, but if we just use it for a moment, if you look at the history of Hinduism, or for instance, the history of Buddhism, there are examples of certain instances where certain sects or communities of practitioners have been persecuted or under threat, but by and large, it's radically different. The idea that there are transformational practices that are tried and tested and reliable across practitioners to allow someone who does that practice for long enough to have transformational, revelatory openings to the reality of the sacred is not a controversial thing. That is a controversial thing in a lot of religious communities within the West, where just that idea is something that people struggle with very often. Less so today, but still a lot. Now, why is this relevant? Why am I talking about religions in relation to singularity when I say that the integration of church and state that singularity stands for is not about a religion? Well, the significance here is that anyone who understands the esoteric dimensions of the religious traditions of our planet will also understand, and has studied them to any degree, will also understand that actually the human beings who have passed through their transformational practices, whether it's within the domain of mystical Christianity, Sufism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, the human beings who have passed through these transformational practices have returned and delivered remarkably coherent and remarkably similar reports of the sacred reality that they've been able to experientially enter into. Yes, there are meaningful differences. Yes, those differences are very worthy of discussion. Yes, I also feel very clear that those differences can be integrated into a whole where they're not in opposition to each other. And isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that human beings from many different parts of the world over millennia who have entered into doing the esoteric practices, the mystical practices to open to and experience revelations of the sacred, have returned to us with very coherent and consistent reports of what that sacred reality is that they've had revealed to them. And what have they shared with us? Well, they've shared with us, well, they've had a revelation that there is, at the deep truth level of things, an indivisible, radical, living unity, which is the foundation and the substance of everything that's arising within the apparent world of diversity. That there is a fundamentally, ecstatically good root to reality that is arising as everything, blessing it with a sense of free will, and yet in the same way, nothing can ever escape from that reality. Maybe they call that reality God, maybe they call it Buddha nature, maybe they call it Dharmakaya, maybe they call it Allah, but maybe they project on it a sense of personhood, maybe they don't. And yet at the same time, there is this uniform singularity, this one indivisible and sacred reality as the foundation and the substance of everything that is revealed again and again and again. Now, people can say, okay, well, that's fine, John. It's fine to talk about that. Isn't, yes, maybe that's even interesting, but how do we know that's real? How do we know that's actually real? Does science discover this? Is science discovering this reality? It doesn't seem so. I'm not reading about that in my newspapers. So how are we going to base some kind of political movement coherently on something like this? The way I respond to that is by saying, yes, there absolutely needs to be an integration of the fundamental principles of science with the fundamental principles of transformational spirituality. So, first of all, just to note that part of my perspective on the reason for the decline in today's world of our Western religious traditions increasingly is because they are cut off in large part from the radical transformational beating heart of their esoteric sections. And so what we're left with is these exoteric shells that are advocating for a particular worldview, creation story, and prescription for a good life in a world where their prescriptions are clearly, day by day, increasingly obviously out of date. There's a problem with, advocating for the biblical Genesis-based creation story of how the world came about, as we are simultaneously in a time of radical breakthrough insights within the fields of cosmology, science, biology, physics, on how they understand the universe has created itself, which actually there's a huge amount of evidence for. There is not a huge amount of evidence for the reality that God created the world in 7 days. This is just an example, and of course, there's all sorts of recommendations, for instance, that exist in the Old Testament. I don't mean to pick on Christianity, but or Judaism as well. But there's in all the spiritual texts, in the exoteric parts of their recommendations of what constitutes a good life, they have all sorts of recommendations to live in such a way that actually for modern values are really problematic. And of course, there's all sorts of people which might say, well, that doesn't mean they're wrong, and yes, there's, people are entitled to their sense of independent moral values. And for a lot of people, the just basic condemnation of homosexuality, for instance, as it exists within a lot of these religious texts, is problematic, is something that belongs to the world that we've left behind increasingly. Not everyone, of course. That's just one example among many. The lower place of women in society, some of these religious texts actually even promote certain ideas of racial superiority and so on. Like these are so many things that actually for many, many, many human beings today, we just feel like, I can't get with that, and if that's how we're defining our religion, then that's a problem for me. I think that is a problem, because actually these things are out of date. Now, the transformational esoteric core of our spiritual traditions maybe have some pieces which are out of date too. And a lot of those practices are actually timeless. That's where we have technologies, we have experiential, somatic, psychological, consciousness based technologies that are tried and tested over millennia for producing radical, life changing openings for people to their experience of the sacred in a way that produces transformations of their sense of morality, transformations of their sense of what it means to live a good life, transformations of them, the degree to which they can show up as powerful, loving actors in the world that produce positive change in their environments. And getting back to this point around, okay, but how much of that is actually real, John? How much of that is actually pointing to something that's real? The way I describe this is, let's take the two fundamental tenets within the philosophy of science for what constitutes uh, yeah, a supported scientific discovery, should we say. Those basic tenets are reliability and validity. Reliability means that if various different people around the world do the same experiment, they're going to get the same result. That there is a repeatability of the result that a person gets when they do the same experiment, they follow the same steps. Validity refers to whether that result actually tells us something true about the nature of life and reality. Those are the two fundamental tenets for what constitutes a valid, reliable scientific discovery according to the philosophy of science. My sense is that those can, we have a very interesting conversation when we apply those to the esoteric processes as they exist, the esoteric practices that exist within the transformational practices as they exist within the esoteric core of our spiritual pathways and traditions. And what we realize there is that those practices are absolutely reliable. And what I mean by that is, if you have people, and this has been the case for millennia, people who do these different practices for the prescribed amount of time and they give themselves to it in the prescribed way, at some point they will have the opening, they will have the experience that will involve a deeper and transformational revelation of the sacred that all practitioners have had over time doing those practices. Next question is whether it's valid, right? But are those experiences actually giving us a true experience, a true revelation of what is really real? Lots of people can have enlightenment experiences, but is that actually an insight into the true nature of reality in a way that we should trust? Now, this is where things become more tricky. They become more tricky because our methods of scientific validation do not extend all the way through to being able to know the ultimate nature of reality. We can't test for that just yet. So we cannot scientifically validate spiritual experiences. We cannot. However, where I go with this is, if anyone has heard of or read William James, who was one of the early pioneers in the development of psychology, and he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he listed 5, I think it was, qualities or factors of what seems to constitute transformational mystical experiences across history. And one of those that he named was what he called the noetic quality. The noetic quality. And the noetic quality is that the experience is self-validating. Now, what I mean by that is that it is a uniform aspect of transformational spiritual experience through time, that there is a quality of the experience. When people have had enlightenment experiences, awakening experiences, there is a quality of the experience where one just knows. Where there is something in that experience that is so compelling, that is so impactful, that triggers something so deep in us that knows this is about what's true. That there's been a deeper revelation here of something that is maybe masked or covered or seen, difficult to see when we're not in such an experience in our world, but is true. There's a saying within the Dzogchen teachings in Tibetan Buddhism that even if, and once you've had an authentic awakening experience, even if 1,000 Buddhas appeared on your door the next morning and told you that your experience was false, you'd be able to just say, actually, I'm okay. trust my experience and close the door. So we need to just let that be as it is, in my view. We need to respect that there may be a self-validating dimension to these experiences. And if you're someone who radically doubts that, if you're someone who says, no, I can't get with that, and you want to argue against it, my suggestion is try and disprove it yourself. Do the experiment. Engage yourself in a period of committed spiritual practice according to the prescribed practices for the prescribed amount of time to have those experiences open in you, and see if when they do, you feel this is not telling you something deeper about reality. That's my invitation. Before anyone has the impulse to criticize this, do the experiment and see about the data that you get. Now, what we know about those who have done that experiment, who have gathered that data, and who have then shared their data with a community of the adequate, i.e. other practitioners who have done that experiment as well, is, as I say, there's a remarkable uniformity to the data that they've returned. And that data is, there is a radical, sacred, indivisible reality that is the beating heart of all apparent diversity, and that is what is most deeply, fundamentally, compellingly true. Yeah? So that's the realization that we get to if we cross the schism that exists within Western civilization between between the presence of our exoteric dimensions of our religious traditions and the loss of the esoteric dimensions. When we heal that, then what we get is actually we've got a global tradition of revelation. This is the idea behind the perennial philosophy. We've got a global tradition of revelation. Yes, where people are bringing through different realizations in different ways, but I would argue that's because they're not speaking to a different reality. People are having realizations about different aspects of human experience. You could say, like, the Abrahamic traditions are often having revelations about the reality of the soul and its relationship to the divine. The Eastern traditions are often having revelations about the true nature of consciousness. The shamanic traditions are having revelations about the multidimensional energetic realities of the ecosystems in the earth we're a part of. These are not competing realities. They're different frequencies of what is true. Yeah. So, and these are experiences that can be entered into and experienced by anyone who does the experiment. So, my sense is that what this builds to is a place where there can be a fundamentally transformational reintegration of the sacred into Western culture and into our politics, our social systems, our educational systems, our economics, not in a way that's based on belief, not in a way that's based on anyone telling anyone that they have to believe anything, but on our recognition of there having been a global millennia and millennia and millennia old tradition of human beings penetrating into the reality of the sacred across cultures, across traditions, across pathways, across nations, across periods of time, bringing back radically similar through to deeply coherent revelations about what that is, us trusting the data that those human beings have gathered, not necessarily trusting them as perfect exemplars of it all the time, but trusting the fact that, if you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people telling you the same thing over, vast distances, that's worth listening to. And it's not just hundreds and hundreds, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And then what we need to do as well is have that integrated into the miracles that science is telling us more and more of the reality of the world that we live in. Just the fact that the sun is transforming 4 billion tons of itself into light in every single second in a way that makes life here possible. The fact that life can exist in conditions at the bottom of the ocean and made underwater volcanoes that we never imagined. Just the details and the data that we've been able to gather about the simple functioning of the universe that we're a part of, the fact that mathematics works, the fact that mathematics seems to tell us certain regularly patterned realities about not just what's going on our planet, but what's going on in another galaxy, what that means for the structure and the intelligence of the cosmos we're a part of. When we put all of this together, it is incontrovertible that we are participating in a sacred, in, unspeakably intelligent miracle that asks that we make that the foundation stone of the systems that we build so that they are in alignment with life and so that they are in alignment with truth rather than the systems that we have right now, which are life denying, life draining, and truth denying. Because we're wrapped up in this idea that truth can only be, that truth is some relative thing, that maybe some people believe this and some people believe that. So I've made this video because I want to set the foundation for the healthy post Enlightenment, and I mean Western Enlightenment, reintegration of church and state here. You know, one of the revelatory, definitely evolutionary aspects of the Western Enlightenment was the differentiation of church and state. And it's fundamentally good that we excavated ourselves from a situation where how our politics and how our social reality and how our communities and cultures work was being dictated by church authorities who were making belief. Church authorities who were participating in the exoteric dimension of religions, separated off and persecuting the esoteric dimension of religions, who were making belief law and punishing those who did not believe what they said they should. Absolutely, that needed to end. And it was an evolutionary victory for that differentiation between church and state to happen and for our societies to, you know, Western liberal democracies to emerge as they have. And there's problems. There's fundamental problems that come from our disconnection from the sacred, and it affects the way that we treat the world and each other. So what Singularity stands for is a fundamental post-Western Enlightenment reintegration of church and state that is coherent, intellectually rigorous, can stand up to debate, and based on the integration of spirituality and science, and particularly, you know, the use of the philosophy of science to look deeply into and provide a coherent foundation for the data that human beings across spiritual traditions in their esoteric dimensions over millennia and across cultures have been gathering, that tell us about the reality of the sacred that has ever and always been here. So, yeah, we'll build on this foundation. Thank you for watching.